create our deep water scene, we're going to be mostly focusing on atmosphere. So we're going to start out within the atmosphere editor, and I'm going to just move our camera a little and have that update. And then we're going to go up to our atmosphere editor, and we're going to be working with the spectral model. And we're going to go to the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab to start out with. And what I want to do is set our sky mean altitude all the way up to 10,000 meters. And I'm going to set our ground density to 64%. And now we're not really seeing a whole lot right now, but as we start modifying a little bit more, we'll start to see more of an underwater, deep water sort of effect and environment. And we'll move on to the rest of our settings, go to our decay amount, and we are going to set that to 89%. And then we want to set our decay mean altitude to around 8,100 meters. And then we can move on to our fog and haze, which is going to make up a large amount of the effect that we're going to see. And what I want to do is change our haze color to black and do the same for our fog, because of course all of this light is not going to be coming from the sunlight at all, and we're going to have other lights in the scene simulating sort of what it would look like from a ship. And we'll set our haze ground density to 83%, and now we can start to see the effect sort of show up. We'll move to our haze mean altitude, and we are going to set that to 5,100. Actually, we'll go ahead and set that down to 510 just for now. And if we need to increase that, we can. But first we want to bring up our ground density. And we are going to set our fog ground density to 89%. A little bit higher. And you can see as we move through the slider how that starts to really darken the screen and the overall environment. And we are going to leave the mean altitude all the way up to 1,000 meters. And if we take a look at the glow intensity right now, we're not really seeing any sort of an effect. So we can basically leave these two functions on the bottom at around default. If we need to, we can play around with those later to see what we end up with. I'm going to change our aerial perspective just to 8 right now. If I bring this down to 1, we can see the effect on our horizon. As I bring that up to 10, it has a nice fade out, and of course that will change with our altitude of the scene. And I'm going to leave that at 8 right now, but we can always change that depending on what we end up with. We're going to move over to the light tab now. And we want to set a couple of things in here. First of all, our global ambience is what we're going to be using. Although we can always switch this to a little bit of a higher lighting standard. Although for these deep water shots, global ambience does work really well. But we do need to modify our light color and our ambient light color. But first let's set our light balance. And I'm going to bring this down to 20%. And now we can see we're working with a lot more of the ambient light than we are with the sunlight. Because of course we don't want to be using our sunlight for this scene, because this deep down into our water we're not going to be seeing any effects of the sun whatsoever. And we're going to be relying entirely on the lights that we're going to be creating to simulate sort of a deep water ship and deep water craft at these lower levels. And if we take a look at the light color now and the ambient light, I'm going to right mouse click on our light color and go to edit color. And now I have a couple of things I've saved out for both of these colors working previously. And for our light color we're going to be using with RGB values. Red's going to be 0, green 22, blue 46. And we can see we're just at the top of our spectrum here of the blue, and kind of more towards something a little bit darker. And I'm going to click OK. And we're not really seeing that overall change. There's not many objects in the scene, and that will change over time. Our ambient light color is going to really make a drastic effect, because right now we're mostly lighting our scene with ambient light. So I'm going to edit that color, And now our ambient light, I have set the red to 0, green to 33, and blue to 69. Once I change that, now we can see a very dark scene. And if we take a look at our ground plane, which is just that default color right now, we can see it's very washed out, and we're not really seeing a whole lot of the overall effect. Now we can see as we start to bring the camera up really high, that aerial perspective will make a huge difference. So depending on how much you're going to be moving around within the scene, you may need to set that a little bit lower, whether or not you need to have it on at all. So before we start lighting this overall area, we do want to have something to work with in the scene in order to tell what's really going on the surface and on the floor. So I'm going to load in just a standard terrain, and I'm going to go ahead and scale this up. And I can squish this down on our Z-axis, but we just want a little bit of depth in there, some variation. I'm going to right mouse click and go to Edit Object, which will bring up our terrain editor. And what I can do is go up to the top and hit ×2. I'm going to hit that twice so we have a 1024 by 1024 pixel terrain. And actually I'll go ahead and bring it up one more step to make it 2048 by 2048. Now this is still going to look very pixelated because we created this at 256 by 256. So we can go over to the left and we're going to select mountain. And that will roughen it up a bit. And click OK. And now whether or not you want to have really smooth sand, you can modify that. But we can see right now with the mountain, we have more of a rocky surface. So I'll right mouse click, go to Edit Object, and if we want we can go to our road settings, and I'm just going to zoom in. And now if I use our diffusive, you can see that we're really smoothing out those smaller spots, but overall the terrain is still very rocky. So we could put a little bit of thermal erosion in there and kind of mess with that in order to smooth it out. I could also do that manually with a brush, or select a different preset for our mountain on the left. But right now I'm going to stick with this because it's good enough to really see our scene. And what I want to do is just copy this, and I want to make sure I change this to our move gizmo. I'm going to hit Control-C and then Control-V to copy and paste this terrain. And then I'm going to do that once again, and we're just moving it across to create 4 different terrains. And that way, once we're in our scene, we're going to have a little bit more variation, and we can start to see into the distance with a little bit of definition. And I'm going to move that to our scale gizmo and move up one of the back ones and our one to the right, just to give us an idea of the depth of the scene. But what I also want to do is change this material, because right now we're working with just that default. So I'll start with our first terrain, and I'll set up the material for this, and then we can just copy and paste it onto the other ones. So what I'm going to do is just load in one of our terrains we already have. I'm going to go to Rocks and select Sand. And now I want to zoom in just a bit in order to see the overall scale. And it looks like that's going to be a little too small, so I want to increase that scale to 2. And now we can see that a little bit better. And I also want to reduce our bump within the Advanced Material Editor. And right now we have it at 0.5. I'm going to set this to 0.1 because really, at this depth, we're not going to have the sort of waves that create the kind of sand we would see towards the surface or towards shorelines. And what we could even do is smooth that out entirely to get rid of that effect if you wanted to change it up a bit. But another thing is we have more of a brownish sand, and I'm going to change this to something a little more white. So I'm going to load a color map just by right mouse clicking on it, and we can go to our solid colors and just select white. Click OK, and now we have white sand. And what I'm going to do is just move our scene out and our camera, pulling it out of the view. And I want to open up our material browser and our material summary. And now we can see that sand material along with our default. And what I can do is just select our sand and drag and drop it onto our other terrains, which can be a little bit quicker than copying and pasting. And we'll zoom back in just a bit. And what I also want to do is change our aspect of our camera. So we're working with 16 by 9. So I'm going to right mouse click on our render options. I'm going to go to Final, change render to screen, and that way we can activate our aspect ratio and set whether or not we're rendering within our main camera view, because of course we want this to pop up and be a different window. So I can change this now to 16 by 9, and I'll bring this up to an 800 by 450 render. And I'm going to go ahead and just render out a quick frame of this so we can take a look and see how it's looking so far. Now we can see the scene looks very drab, but we have a very nice fade into the distance for our terrains. But the main thing is we can see a lot of light. And right now we really shouldn't be able to see anything because we don't want that sunlight influencing the scene. So I'm going to go to our color of our sunlight, go to Edit Color, and now I have a couple of saved already, and a couple of different colors saved here that I have for different light settings. And the one I'm going to select right now, I'll go ahead and select that little bit lighter one. It's a red 226, green 251, and blue 254. So it's a very, very light blue. Go ahead and click OK. And now we can see a little more of a blue tint to the scene. And now I want to adjust our light balance a little bit more, going to our light intensity. And we'll go ahead and decrease that value, and bringing that down to the point where we really can't see anything in the scene anymore. Click OK, and I'll go ahead and render that out. And now we can see barely any of the terrain. So that should be a good starting point to start working with our other lights. And the first light we're going to start out with is going to be a point light. And we're going to be placing this behind the camera to give a nice little look of that murkiness in our water. Because right now we don't have a water plane creating our murkiness. We're relying on fog, and we also want to use volumetric lights. So go ahead and double click just on our top view there for the main camera. And we just want to get that camera in view, and we can see it right there. Go ahead and select that so you can see it a little bit better. And what I want to do is just go ahead and click behind our camera, which will basically set a point for where our object is going to be created. So just behind our camera on the top view. We'll just go ahead and click with the left mouse button, go to our left, and we can right mouse click on the icon for our light. I'm going to add in just a quadratic point light. And I'm going to position that just behind our camera and go ahead and move that down. And I want to change the color of this light to basically match the other light that we had. So we can edit that color and just select the same one, or we can select something a little bit darker, which is what I'm going to do in this case. And we have a red 172, green 219, and blue 253. So it's a little bit darker than our other one. We can take a look. We can see it's more towards the blue rather than the green light, or the green color. Go ahead and select that. And now we're not really seeing anything in our scene right now because the power is set extremely low. So what I can do is increase that, and we'll start to see that lighting our terrain. But we mostly want to focus on the volumetric settings right now, because of course that power will really affect that overall look. So let's start out by clicking on our volumetric button here, and that'll automatically turn on our volumetrics. We can right mouse click and go to Edit Volumetric Settings. And now let's adjust our intensity. We can go ahead and bring that down a little to about 0.55. Click OK. And we're going to move down a little bit closer to our terrain. But of course we do want to be by that light still, so I'm going to bring our camera back up. And I can just select it and move it down to be in front of our light. And I'm going to go to our quadratic light in the bottom in our layers and select it. And then in the top right we can select its motion options. And I'm going to select Link to Main Camera. So now every time I move our camera, that light is going to go with it, sort of as if the camera is our craft in our underwater craft. And as we move up into our scene, we can see that effect not lighting the terrain. We move down a little closer, and we start to see that a little bit better. And of course we'll modify those settings a little bit more to make them look better, and we're also going to be adding more lights to overall influence the scene. And because of that, I'm going to select our quadratic light again and reduce its power, because we just want a little bit of a hint right now of lighting that overall area. I'm also going to go to our atmosphere editor, go to Sky, Fog, and Haze, and just turn down that aerial perspective just so we can move up a little bit higher without having that effect we were getting before. And we might need to adjust our light balance once again. But first let's move on and create our spotlights, which are going to be more craft lights that we have, ones that we can move around while we're animating and moving through the scene. And it'll make it look a lot more interesting and a little more realistic. Okay, we'll start out by adding in a quadratic spotlight. And I'm going to position this up and move this to the side of our camera. And now we can see the rotation is pointing down right now, so I'm going to select just our rotation gizmo, and we can move that to be facing in the direction of our terrain. And now we can also rotate this. We don't want it to be perfectly straight, and we want just a little bit of an angle, so we can see that cone affecting certain areas. And now I'm going to link this, just as we did before, to our main camera. So now we can move around our camera, and that spotlight will move with it. So now we can see that showing up on our terrain. And we'll select that again, because right now we can see we have a very harsh line around the edge. So what I want to do is go to our first tab, and we're going to change our fall off and just increase that value. And the more we increase that, the softer of a light we're going to get. So it really depends on the type of light you want to simulate, but I like to have something a little bit softer because I think it looks a little more realistic. But now what we want to do is turn on our volumetric light. So we can right mouse click, select volumetric light, edit our volumetric settings, and I'm just going to reduce our intensity to 0.62, click OK. We can see that showing up. I'm going to reduce our power a little. And now we also have to change our color of this light to match our other one. So I'm going to edit color and select our little bit of a darker blue light. And we can see that showing up, and it looks pretty good. And now we can go ahead and copy this and paste it and move it to the other side of our camera, so that we have two different lights. And of course you can set up as many as you want. And what I could also do, just before I copy this, is reduce our spread just a little bit lower and have just a little bit tighter of a light so that we can see more of the beam. And I'm also going to move this up just a little bit higher. And now we can select our light, Control C to copy, Control V to paste, move it to the other side of our camera, go ahead and rotate that to match the angle that we have of our other light, or something off a little bit. And of course we're going to be animating those and moving them around, and that'll look a lot more realistic. We want to make sure that this is linked to the camera as well as our other lights. And now we can start moving around our scene and see these lights affecting our different objects. And when we don't have any objects in view, we can see that overall haze effect and fogginess of our water. And moving closer to our terrain, we can see that brightening up a lot more. And overall it looks pretty good right now. But of course we are still going to need to make a few more modifications because our main sunlight is still affecting our scene a little bit too much. So we'll go up to our atmosphere editor, and under light we can go ahead and darken that more. Move our camera and just see the effects of our new lights. And I'll go ahead and just position this a little bit closer to that peak right there, and I can render out a frame, and we'll be able to see that a little bit better. And now what we might want to do is just increase that volumetric setting on our spotlights. And also what we need to do is either increase the scale of our terrains and the overall size of the scene, or increase a couple of other settings so that we can't see these back terrains that we have, because of course we wouldn't be able to see that much of the underwater. So we'll start out by selecting our first spotlight. We're going to modify that, and then we can copy the settings over to our other light. So I'm going to increase our intensity, and now we're not going to see that update, but if we move our camera just a little, then we can see a nice little render of what's going on in the scene. So we're just increasing that. I'll just type in 1 to make it a round number so we don't have any decimals, and I'll move over to our quadratic spot, the second one, and increase that intensity to 1 as well. And now we can see something a little bit bigger. What we can also do is maybe increase that spread a little bit more, because it might have brought it down too much. So I'll bring that up to 17.5, and I'm going to do the same for our other. That's looking a little bit better now. And we can go ahead and look around. And now one thing you'll notice is that we can see our sun. So what we're going to need to do is make some modifications for that as well, because of course we do not want to see the sun in our underwater scene. So what I want to do is move our camera out quite a bit so we can get a better scale for our scene, because we want this to be much larger. And now we're going to select our terrains, just in the layer view, selecting our first terrain, holding down Shift, and then selecting our last one, which will select every one in between. And I'm going to change this to our scale gizmo. Make sure we have this set to global, and then we can select in the middle and just scale these up. And go ahead and squish this down maybe a little on the Z. And now we can just start to move in towards the scene and our terrains that we have. And we'll start to see those show up once we get close enough. Now we're really not seeing a whole lot because we've increased the overall size. So what we need to do is also increase the power of our lights, because now we have something a little more real scale, and we can see that little peak right there, but that's going to disappear very quickly as we move away from that object. So we'll go into our first quadratic spot. I'm going to increase our power, and we may need to decrease the overall volumetric effect of that. So I'm going to edit our volumetric settings, bring that down to 0.5. And even though as we increase our power, we will notice that effect get lighter, the more we reduce the volumetric effect, the more we can light our objects with that light without having to worry about creating too much of an effect like we see like this. So what I actually want is a power of about 400. So I'm going to start with that. We can go to edit our volumetric setting and reduce the intensity until we get to a point where we can work with both of those together. And now we can see we're lighting that terrain directly in front of us, but we're really not seeing too much of the volumetric effect. So we'll increase that a little bit more. And that might be a little bit too much. So I'm going to type in a value of 0.08 and go ahead and move our camera a little, and that looks pretty good. So we'll go ahead and copy those settings over to our other light, power of 400, edit our volumetric setting, 0.08, click OK, and now we can see those two lights. Now we also need to increase the settings of our light that's directly behind our camera so that we get a nice overall global effect. So we'll select our quadratic point light, and I'm going to increase its power, and now we can see that lighting the entire area. And overall that looks pretty good. I am going to change our fall off for our spotlights and increase the fall off all the way to 100 to get rid of some of those harsh edges. And what I also want to do is adjust the rotation, and I can also move them off to the side just a little. But basically we want to pay attention to where that cone is, because we don't want too much of an overlap, but we still want it to look like it is coming almost directly from the camera and its area. And we may need to change the pitch or tilt up our lights just a little. So we'll go ahead and do that. And we can see that effect. It looks pretty good. As we move far away from our terrain, we can see that all we see is our lights affecting the water. And what I also want to do is just adjust our first sunlight, the main sunlight of the scene. We're going to go up to the atmosphere editor, go to the sun tab, and I'm going to increase our pitch. And this is still going to be affecting the scene a little, but changing that amount will give us a little more variation. And I'm going to go to the size of the sun and change that to no visible sun. And that way we won't see it in our render. We'll move a little bit closer to our terrain, and we can see those lights showing up and giving us a fairly realistic looking effect. And we'll go ahead and render that out. And we can see that looks pretty good. Of course, there's not a whole lot in the scene right now except those terrains. And one thing you notice is we still see that terrain in the background pretty well, so we will need to modify those settings so that will disappear. We're going to go to the atmosphere editor, and under light you can see we have it all the way to dark, And I can set that all the way to ambient, and that way our sunlight will not be affecting our shadows at least. And then under our sky dome lighting gain, if we reduce that amount, what will happen is it will darken everything, and we start to see all of those areas where our terrain is in the background. And even with our aerial perspective off, that's still going to be a problem. So normally you could darken that area by decreasing the lighting gain, but we want to make sure that we're leaving that at 0, because this isn't set up like a typical scene. It's not something that we'd be using to, of course, have clouds and lighter areas. So we're going to go over to the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab, and now most of our settings for our densities are really high. If we go ahead and increase those a little bit more, it will start to darken up that outer area. And we can do our fog as well, but still we can kind of see that outline. So let's take a look at increasing our altitude of our haze. Now we can see if we move that all the way up to the highest value, a lot of that has been removed, and that's because of the size of our scene and the overall distances between our objects. So let's go ahead and render out another frame, and we can take a look. And now we've completely removed that area in the back, and it's definitely fading out a lot more, where we don't see that higher peak in the back, and we can see just a little bit of that front area. What we might need to do is turn down some of the volumetric light settings on that area light that's behind the camera. But overall, this looks pretty good right now. You can see as we start to move a little bit farther away from our terrain, you can see a little bit of a different effect. Go ahead and take a look in our top view, and we can see where our lights are positioned and whether or not we need to move them or move around that light in the back. So let's go ahead and select a quadratic spotlight or point light, set that to move, and I'm going to change that to, actually local doesn't look like it's really going along too well, so we'll go back to global, and we can just move that forward, and now we can see the effect that that is having on our scene. So whether or not we need to move that back, and now we can see something a little bit darker, but we still have a nice overall haze that's being created just by the lights in general. So that way we can still have our spotlights that have the main area of influence, but we want to make sure we have this point light just to create that overall glow within the scene. We'll go ahead and take a look in our camera view, and now you can see we're inside of the terrain, so it does look a little strange. We'll go ahead and move that back up. And another thing you want to keep in mind is whether or not that light that is behind the camera is going to end up inside of a terrain. So if I was to move our camera over to this peak over here, and kind of put it on the other side, and then if we move down our camera a little bit, what can happen is our lights will go into our terrain even though our camera hasn't, and now all of our light is being blocked off. So that is one thing you have to keep in mind while using this technique. But what we can do is turn off shadows in our light beams, but then if we have any different objects in the scene that we want to have casting shadows within those beams, that can be a little bit of a problem. So it's just one thing you can watch while you're animating that camera. Or what we can do is bring those lights a lot closer to our camera and reduce some of those settings and bring them down just a little bit, and that will also decrease the chance of that happening. Go ahead and render out another frame, and we can see from this angle it looks really good. So we have a very good starting point for an underwater scene. We'll be able to add objects to this, animate our camera, and of course add other elements within the water to make it look more realistic. Because of course right now there's nothing in our water, and we want to have little bits of particles showing up and something just to make it a little more realistic without just the terrains and that blank water.